Hello, my name is Christina Davis. I'm the director of the program of U.S.-Japan Relations at Harvard University. Welcome and thank you for joining us for a panel on Japan, South Korea, and U.S. alliance politics in East Asia. This is a topic of great importance. There are so many reasons that we would expect Japan and Korea would hold close ties as fellow democracies that share deep economic interdependence, an alliance with the United States, and a common concern about the development of North Korea's missile and nuclear capabilities. But of course, we all realize that relations between Japan and South Korea are not so simple and have been marked by deep tensions due to historical, territorial issues. And in some cases, the United States has had to try and mediate these difficulties between its allies as it is building strategic coordination to try and come up with a common front addressing the many crises in the region. Over the summer, some steps have been taken to improve trilateral cooperation. In June, we saw Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and President Yoon Suk-yeol meet on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Madrid. In August, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force, the South Korean Navy, and the United States Navy all participated in a missile warning ballistic missile search and tracking exercise in Hawaii. Also, they have joined together in trade relations as members of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which brings Japan and South Korea for the first time to be sharing open free trade preferential agreement. Last week, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting, Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon held a bilateral talk, committing themselves to improve bilateral relations. All of these are signs of progress. Even as the three countries are pursuing further cooperation, however, North Korea just fired a ballistic missile off its coast again. To help us understand this important area of crisis and cooperation, we are very fortunate to have with us two distinguished speakers who will help us understand better. Our first speaker, Professor Junya Nishino, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law and Politics and director of the Center for Korean Studies at Keio University. Professor Nishino is a widely published scholar of contemporary Korean politics, Japan-Korean relations, and international relations of East Asia. Writing in Japanese about East Asia transition and the North Korea problem, his book Tenkanki no Higashi Asia no Kita-chosen Mondai came out from Keio University Press in 2012. He has also published several pieces in English on history, memory, and politics in post-war Japan, and he served as a visiting scholar at the Harvard Yenching Institute here in the year 2011 and 2012. Tonight, he will be discussing developments in Japan-ROK relations. And Professor Nishino is joining us from Seoul, so actually it is his Tuesday morning that he is kind to share his time with us. Our second speaker is Soo-mi Terry, who is the director of the Asia program and the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. She has served as the senior analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, Director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the National Security Council, and Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council. She is widely published, commented, and testified extensively on issues related to the Korean Peninsula and East Asian security. Recently, her articles on North Korea's nuclear opportunism was published in the Foreign Affairs Journal in March. She's going to speak with us about the crisis in the Korean Peninsula, sharing her insights about the latest developments. Our seminar is part of a series on policy innovations and crises, which has been supported by a generous grant from the Japan Foundation. Our event is also co-sponsored by the Korea Institute of Harvard University. I'd like to also invite you next week to join us for our future event, which will be looking at Sapporo, the Ainu, and the nature of Japanese settler colonial urbanism, where we will be joined by Michael Thornton and moderator Andrew Gordon. And please remember the Zoom etiquette that you will keep your microphone muted while our speakers are talking, and write a question in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to participate. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open up for question and answer, concluding at 9:15. Thank you so much. Without any further delay, let me turn over to Professor Nishino.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting this seminar, the hosting by the U.S. Japan program at Harvard University. So today I will talk on the trilateral cooperation, but basically the focusing on the Japan-ROK recent development. So firstly, we just look at the recent development in bilateral ties, especially after the inauguration of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. And next, I want to talk about the restraining factors and driving force in the bilateral ties, and just a little bit talk about trilateral cooperation among U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And lastly, I will give some recommendation. So firstly, the recent development in Japan-ROK ties. After the presidential election in South Korea, Prime Minister Kishida sent a congratulatory message to the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, and at the inauguration ceremony of Yoon Suk-yeol in May in Seoul, the Prime Minister Kishida sent a special envoy, Foreign Minister Hayashi, to the inauguration ceremony, and Foreign Minister Hayashi held a talk with the Park Jin, and as Professor Davis mentioned, the Kishida and Yoon had a brief meeting at the NATO summit meeting, and also we Japan and South Korea had 2 times foreign ministerial meetings in July and August. And very recently, the Kishida Yoon had a summit meeting on the sideline of the UN General Assembly. So as we see, we've now seen the very development in bilateral ties. But still, we, Japan and South Korea have a difficulty and a pending issue. Especially the important pending issue is the so-called the forced labor, or in Japanese the wartime labor issue, which South Korean Supreme Court made a decision about the liquidation of the seized Japanese asset. So we have a very urgent issue, and also structurally we have some restraining factors. First one is a lack of trust, especially from the Japanese perspective. We Japanese and the political leaders have a very sense of the lack of trust between Japan and South Korea, because especially for Prime Minister Kishida, he was a foreign minister at the time when 2 countries agreed a foreign comfortment agreement in 2015. And actually, the Japanese government position on the wartime labor issue is that this issue was completely and finally solved in 1965 agreement. But South Korean side raised the question on this issue, and now we have a very urgent pending issue in this area. And the second restraining factor is national sentiment. Actually, I would say that South Koreans always have a very sensitive sentiment towards Japan due to the unfortunate past between the 2 countries. But I would say that at this point, more importantly, Japanese citizens have more, in a way, pessimistic and very frustration towards South Korea than South Koreans have at this point. So this is a very important aspect when we see the bilateral ties between Tokyo and Seoul. And the last one is the weak political base, both Kishida-san and President Yoon. So as we all know, now both leaders have very low approval rate. So President Yoon have around 30%, and recently Kishida-san's approval rate is dramatically dropping, mainly due to the unification church issue and the state funeral issues, and also as well as economical issue. So these three factors are very negatively impacting on our bilateral ties. But at the same time, now, fortunately, there are driving forces in bilateral ties, especially the most importantly, the unstable situation, not only in the region, but also in the global arena, especially after the Russia's invasion to Ukraine. So these kind of the international, very unstable situation requires both countries to cooperate more in international agendas, especially in this region, rise of China and the North Korean nuclear issues. And the second one is the Yoon Song-yeol's foreign policy and security policies. As we all know, the Yoon's foreign policy agenda slogan is a global pivotal state. So this actually quite similar with the Japan's free and open in the Pacific. So in this context, I really hope that Japan and South Korea cooperate more on global agendas as well as the regional challenges such as China issue and North Korean issue. And lastly, the third driving force is President Biden administration's strong commitment to especially the trilateral cooperation. So we all know that President Biden visited Japan and South Korea in past May, and show really high appreciation to the inauguration of the Yoon Song-yeol's administration, and pursue the reactivating the trilateral cooperation among the three countries. Actually, frankly speaking, in my sense, during the Trump administration period, U.S. government less the not so high commitment to the bilateral alliance and the trilateral cooperation under the Trump administration. But now Biden administration really making efforts to foster trilateral cooperation among the three countries. So these are the driving forces in restoring bilateral relationship. So I just slightly look at the reactivating trilateral cooperation. So just after the Yoon Song embarkment of Yoon administration, the foreign ministerial joint statement among three countries appeared to cope with North Korean issue. And we three countries held a defense ministerial meeting on the sideline of Shangri-La dialogue. And as Professor Davis mentioned, we had the trilateral summit meeting on the sideline of NATO meeting. And also, Professor Davis mentioned we three countries had the Pacific Dragon exercise in Hawaii. And very recently, three national security advisors, Mr. Sullivan and Kim Song-han and Akiba-san met in Hawaii. So these are the we can see very reactivating trilateral cooperation after the embarkment of the Yoon Song-yeol administration. So lastly, I want to make some recommendation, especially in restoring the bilateral relationship between Tokyo and Seoul, which is the weakest link of the trilateral cooperation among the three countries. The first recommendation is that both countries, Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon, needed to restore political channel between the two countries. Frankly speaking, under the leadership of the former President Moon Jae-in and Prime Minister Abe and Suga, we saw a very, how can I say, declining the political channel between the two countries. But after the inauguration of Yoon Song-yeol administration and also Kishida cabinet, we've now seen the very reactivating diplomatic and political channel. So we needed to restore political channel more to restore and to rebuild trust relationship, not only in the political level, but also in the political leadership level between the two countries. And second recommendation is to make more effort to form national consensus, especially in South Korea, to solve the pending issue. I mean the former wartime labor issue. I really highly appreciate that President Yoon is making strong effort to solve the pending issue, wartime labor issue. But because his approval rate is quite low at this time, I think South Korean government will have a very difficulty to persuade his national citizens in solving this urgent liquidation issue. But from Japanese perspective, actually urgent and frequent and fast the restoration of bilateral tie is desirable. But in my perspective, the sustainability of our bilateral tie is quite important, because many Japanese think that yes, we appreciate Yoon's effort to restore bilateral ties, but we are really concerned about 5 years after next president in South Korea. So to restore solid bilateral ties, sustainability is quite important. So in this context, I hope that President Yoon make more effort to form national consensus in solving the issue. And the last recommendation, especially to the Prime Minister Kishida, is that I think Prime Minister Kishida show more appreciation towards the President Yoon's strong effort to restore bilateral ties. And Kishida-san can help widen political and diplomatic space for Yoon Song-yeol to persuade the South Korea's national citizen in solving the very difficult historical issue. For example, my recommendation is that Kishida-san can lift export restriction, which Japanese government posed on South Korean government in 2019. Actually, this issue was quite a sensitive issue in South Korea. And if Kishida-san show the more tangible gesture to Yoon Song-yeol government, then South Korean citizens may accept the improved bilateral ties. So lastly, I want to say that national consensus is quite important, but at this point, President Yoon should make more effort to form national consensus, and also Prime Minister Kishida should show more his appreciation to Yoon Song-yeol government with the tangible measure to South Korean government. So I will stop here and looking forward to lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion of both the constraints and the opportunities, and of course, the important appeal to both sides of leaders to make concessions and form consensus. I really appreciate your overview and analysis. Next, we're going to turn to Sumi Terry.
Thank you. So good evening and good morning to everyone joining us from Tokyo and Seoul and elsewhere. Pleasure to join all of you in this timely and important conversation. And thanks to the organizers of this forum for giving me this opportunity to share with you my assessment on where we are with North Korea and where we are in terms of U.S.-South Korea coordination, policy coordination towards North Korea. So on where we are with North Korea, let me not mince words here. Those of you who know me knows that I'm a straight talker. On the denuclearization front, our respective efforts have failed. And there's no reason to expect that we'll do any better, frankly, in the future, if our goal is still denuclearization of North Korea. I'm sorry to start with such a stark and gloomy picture, but that's where we are today in terms of our respective denuclearization efforts. I don't think we have enough time right now to necessarily get into what went wrong, how we may have mishandled in terms of policy, other than to say that for some time now, we have consistently underestimated North Korea's durability, capability, and desire for nuclear armament. And unfortunately, at many points, our policies coming out of Washington, Seoul, and other places have been inconsistent. But first, let me just talk about where we are in terms of North Korea's nuclear and missile program, before talking about policy coordination efforts between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, and others. First, despite enormous economic difficulties that North Korea has been dealing with since it first closed the border with China in January 2020, you may remember that North Korea was the first country to close the border with China. And since then, despite all the economic difficulties, North Korea has been quite diligent in terms of working on its nuclear and missile programs, and it has made tremendous progress. This year alone, North Korea launched 31 missiles, including ICBMs. In the past year, Kim Jong-un has tested, just to remind you guys, new missile technologies, such as a submarine-launched ballistic missile, train-mounted ballistic missile, new surface-to-air defense missile system, long-range strategic nuclear-capable cruise missile, multiple hypersonic missiles, all in an effort to perfect its own missile and deterrent capabilities, to really diversify its missile arsenal, and to really defeat American missile defenses. So North Korea has been looking for more credible, survivable second strike capability. And what we have today, just to remind all of you watching, is that North Korea that has a runaway nuclear program and continues to push to qualitatively refine its program, to quantitatively to expand its missile forces per Kim Jong-un's own instructions at the 8th Party Congress of the Korean Workers' Party in January of last year. North Koreans are pretty good about telling us what they're going to do. And they told us this in January of last year. So today, what we have is North Korea that has amassed maybe up to 60 nuclear warheads. Some say 30, some say 40, some say 50. The exact number varies. They're producing enough fissile material to make half dozen new bombs annually. 2021 RAND Corporation report projected that North Korea could have around 200 nuclear weapons and hundreds of ballistic missiles stockpiled by 2027. That's only 5 years from now. And available intelligence evidence suggests that North Korea can miniaturize these warheads to fit atop a missile. And Kim Jong-un is now moving on to the next phase, which is placing multiple warheads on a single intercontinental ballistic missile. And this so-called MIRV capability will be designed to, again, frustrate limited US missile defenses and to enhance North Korea's ability to strike the US mainland with nuclear missiles, making North Korea one of just 3 countries in the world, along with China and Russia, to possess this capability. That is a threat that we are facing today. And according to the UN panel of experts report just came out, we are seeing that basically what we are seeing is unprecedented, and their words, intensity, diversity, and operational capability of these missile tests. And by all indications, because we're looking at the continued production of nuclear fissile materials at Yongbyon and the excavation at the Punggye-ri test site, North Korea is now technically prepared for another nuclear test, 7th nuclear test, possibly next generation tactical nuclear weapon. And talking about tactical nuclear weapons, this is another very concerning development. Since North Korea crossed that twin threshold of developing thermonuclear weapon and flight tested intercontinental ballistic missile in 2017, North Korea is now focused on developing tactical nuclear weapons intended for use on and against, on or near the peninsula. Consider North Korea's test last April when it tested new nuclear capable tactical guided missiles. At that time, North Korea tested some 8 missiles with different ranges from 5 different places, from Sunan, Gyecheon, Dongchangri, and Hamhung, and another place, to demonstrate its capability to deploy tactical nuclear weapons. And these missiles were aimed at Pyeongtaek, Busan, variety of places in the south. So we can't just simply say, oh, confidently that this is just about R&D. It's a testing of operational deployment. North Koreans are becoming more and more technical. And as outlined in their own 5-year defense development plan, they are looking at smaller, lighter, miniaturized nuclear warheads on short-range missiles for tactical use, right? So what is very concerning is that on top of all this, in recent months, the Kim regime has also been threatening to launch a preemptive attack, right? So, okay, fine. Some people will say, well, these threats are not necessarily new, but renewed emphasis is still very concerning. Kim Jong-un has ominously warned at a military parade first on April 25th that the Kim regime envisions wider roles for North Korea's nuclear arsenal beyond deterrence and self-defense, that the North will use its weapons not just to prevent war, but preemptively for secondary purpose if the country's interests are threatened. And this statement comes after his own sister, Kim Yo-jong, had already made similar kind of threats about potential preemptive use, threatening that South Korea could face extermination and so on. This is right out of Putin's playbook, right? Putin has been using threat of nuclear escalation to deter the United States and the world from fully supporting Ukraine as it continues to assault Ukraine. So, and then of course, fast forward to just recently on September 9th, at their parliament, this month, while announcing this new nuclear law, right? North Korea announced 5 conditions in which it would launch a preemptive strike, effectively stating that basically a new first use doctrine for its nuclear weapons. And the conditions even include not only when nuclear attack is imminent, which makes sense, but when a non-nuclear strike under leadership and National Nuclear Force Command body has been carried out, they said, even the non-nuclear strike, or when military attack on important strategic assets of the state has been carried out, or when they said, it is operationally unavoidable to prevent expansion of war. So very wide-ranging scenarios when they would preemptively use nuclear weapons. So what the new nuclear law is a step-up effort by the North to really cement its nuclear power status, calling it irreversible, non-negotiable, and so on. Kim Jong-un is basically declaring that the North will never, ever abandon its nuclear arsenal and that it will remain nuclear state. Okay, and that part is not new, right? Because how many times we've heard them say that? But what is surprising is that, Well, so first of all, that's not new since I think early 2012, when North Korea has amended its constitution to include a reference to North Korea's nuclear status. But what is kind of noteworthy right now is that Kim Jong-un said this while introducing this new legislation that enshrined its nuclear status, while while claiming that North Korea will never again engage in talks that's premised on denuclearization. So that's kind of interesting, right? Focus on tactical nuclear weapons, threatening preemptive use, while they're now saying we'll never engage in talks that's premised on denuclearization. Basically, through this new legislation, North Korea is laying the legal groundwork that there will be no future works about denuclearization of North Korea, while having dramatically lowered the threshold of its nuclear weapons use, including preemptive use. And what is very concerning here, with all of this focus on tactical nuclear weapons and preemptive use and all that, is I believe that these tactical nuclear weapons, this focus is aimed ultimately at decoupling. And if you're talking about U.S. ROK alliance relationship, their ultimate goal is to decouple this alliance relationship, right? And just imagine a scenario. The concern is whether Kim Jong-un could wrongly, in the future, just think about this, perhaps under another future U.S. administration who might consider, again, withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea, whether Kim Jong-un could calculate that by threatening preemptive use, or even if he uses tactical nuclear weapons preemptively, his calculation is that as long as he's holding on to the long-range ICBM force in reserve and making threats against U.S. mainland, that it may not necessarily lead to escalation. That in fact, Kim Jong-un could calculate that North Korea could deter nuclear retaliation in kind by Washington. So the concern is that he could calculate that basically the United States does not have the will to defend South Korea in this context, right? So given all this background, so that's the situation with North Korea's nuclear and missile program. So where are we with the U.S.-South Korea coordination on North Korea? Well, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration vowed made all of policymakers in Washington quite happy. He vowed a different kind of North Korea policy than the previous Moon Jae-in administration, because we know that he prioritized engagement with North Korea last year and talked a lot about concluding a peace agreement with the North. But Yoon basically stressed that he would expand military cooperation with the United States, which he seems to be doing, right? The U.S. and South Korea militaries are holding joint exercises right now as we speak for the first time in 5 years. At the same time, President Yoon recently detailed this economic assistance package, what he called a new audacious plan. This is basically a proposal he initially announced in the inauguration speech. He kind of put a little bit more details recently. This new audacious plan is basically in return for Pyongyang taking steps to disarm, which, by the way, we just discussed that North Korea vowed not to do. In return for that, South Korea would help the North with large-scale food program, healthcare, agriculture, infrastructure, and so on. So, of course, predictably, the North and other critics describe this as kind of like, it doesn't seem so audacious, guys. Like, is this kind of like a replica or repeat of Lee Myung-bak's previous proposal or others? For example, when Lee Myung-bak, the former President Lee, basically offered aid to raise North Korea's GDP per capita to $3,000 if it surrendered its nukes. So criticism, of course, is that this so-called new audacious plan is anything but audacious. But in terms of U.S.-South Korea coordination on North Korea, the issue is not really about coordination. There is coordination, right? They're doing, as I said, joint exercises right now. Washington and Seoul, the Biden administration and Yoon administration both understand the need to strengthen regional deterrence and defense capabilities, military readiness. counter-proliferation measures, and so on. They understand this, right? They're talking about enhancing theater and missile defense systems around the Korean Peninsula, Japan and at sea. The Yoon administration also wants to have a more robust discussion with the Biden administration about introducing more advanced air and naval assets to the region, developing and deploying more sophisticated US and South Korean naval capabilities, reinforcing Washington's extended nuclear deterrence options against North Korea, and so on. So there is coordination. And the Yoon administration understands that US and South Korea also need to work with Japan, right? At least he theoretically understands this, to bolster trilateral cooperation. We all know this is a very sensitive topic. We just heard in the previous presentation, this is a very sensitive topic, both Seoul and Tokyo. But the Yoon administration had said that they are interested in repairing ties with Japan, which obviously Washington welcomes. We welcome any opportunity for Seoul and Tokyo to take steps to reconcile and to bolster trilateral cooperation to improve deterrence on North Korea. The key challenge is not coordination, but the key challenge for us is that while we can say the Biden and the Yoon administrations are closely coordinating on North Korea, the concern is that the external environment continues to also favor the North rather than the alliance right now. What do I mean by favorable external environment for the North when they have just have a lot of problems economically with food shortages and whatnot? Why do I say there's a favorable external environment for the North? It's not just intensifying US-China competition, which has been just really unhelpful in terms of China working with the United States on North Korea, right? Because China has moved on. They're not helping us on North Korea. Add to this, in this context, the war in Ukraine, which has made the world more bifurcated, right? And we're now seeing tightening relations between China and Russia, and sort of an uneasy alliance between Xi Jinping and Putin, which points to a possible geopolitical realignment. And this has an important implications, not only globally and for the region, but of course on North Korea's calculation. For North Korea, first of all, the Ukraine war has only further underscored the importance of nuclear weapons, obviously, for security, right? Because they know insofar as, Russia would have been unlikely to have initiated war in Ukraine had Ukraine not have given up nuclear weapons through the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, thereby further decreasing prospects of North Korea's denuclearization. So the lessons that Kim drew from Iraq and Libya is that the leaders who give up nuclear weapons are at serious risk of being overthrown and killed. And that lesson has been reinforced by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in addition to getting wrong lessons from the Ukraine war, for the North, I say the external environment is favorable because the world is distracted, right? And amid the war in Ukraine and China and Russia, they are being unhelpful. They were not really all that helpful before, but they are truly being unhelpful right now, right? We couldn't even get the United Nations Security Council to condemn an intercontinental ballistic missile launch earlier this year, right? So basically, North Korea has a wide open pathway to further testing and escalation. Like, what is to stop them? There's no fear of any kind of real consequences, right? And just look at President Biden's, his major speech at United Nations last week. He literally devoted one line to North Korea. Comparison, like, you remember when President Trump, called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man on a suicide mission, and so much of his speech was on North Korea. President Biden actually mentioned North Korea, like one line about how North Korea blatantly is violating international sanctions, but very fleeting mention of North Korea. So that really demonstrates where we are, right? Where's Washington on North Korea? I think it's indifference, frustration, and distraction. President Yoon, by the way, in his speech, did not even mention North Korea at all. Again, departure from the Moon administration when President Moon used his speech at UNGA to push for an end of war declaration. So all of this is to say, yes, Washington and Seoul are working closely on North Korea policy, But again, we are at an impasse with the North. And the unfortunate reality really is that at the present moment, it appears that two allies do not seem to have good options. And in Japan too, like we do not have very good options beyond deterrence and simply seeking to reduce and manage the North Korean threat. I think I went over my allotted time, or 15, 20 minutes. So why don't I just pause there and take questions?
Thank you so much. It's a little scary to hear that North Korea is even more determined for a very comprehensive approach to its nuclear program development, and that the US and South Korea may be too distracted to mount a concerted priority on this issue. So that's an important warning for us to hear and a great place to launch discussion. I'd like to open up first now to question from one of our associates. Tokuhiro Ikeda is a senior fellow with the Asia Center. He's a former vice admiral of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. And while here at Harvard, he is doing research on East Asia security, maritime security, and nuclear proliferation. Ikeda-san, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much for your meaningful presentation today. I would like to ask you both one question each. My first question is from Professor Nishino. The Japanese government and Japanese people believe that Koreans' claim against Japan are out of line with diplomatic common sense. And as you mentioned, national sentiment is not so good. So therefore, for the time being, it seems unlikely that Japan will become more tolerant of Korea in bilateral relations. Do you think Japan should or could more tolerant of Korea in the current situation? So I find it quite difficult. However, the current situation in the East Asia region have many issues that needed to be solved through trilateral cooperation among the three countries. So I think it is necessary to put aside the bilateral resolution of the issue between Japan and South Korea and give priority to the trilateral resolution of the issue. What do you think about it? Next is, I have a question for Terry. Thank you very much for a very concrete presentation, explanation of the North Korea's nuclear and weapons. So since Japan adopted the policy of the three non-nuclear principles, discussion of nuclear weapons has been taboo. However, nuclear threats from North Korea and China have increased, and Russia mentioned the possibility of using nuclear weapon when it invaded the Ukraine. In this situation, former Prime Minister Abe insisted on the need to share nuclear weapons with the US. But the current administration of Prime Minister Kishida has declared the government will not discuss nuclear sharing. A discussion of nuclear weapons continue to be weak in Japan. In your Foreign Affairs article, you mentioned the possibility of Japan possessing nuclear weapon. Do you believe that the will to possess nuclear weapon is deeply rooted in Japan? That is my question. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. Nishino Sensei, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for question and comment. I totally agree with the Ikeda-san's observation on the current situation and the foreseeable future in bilateral ties. So from the Japanese perspective, I personally think that the Kishida-san really know that the Japan should and must cooperate with Yoon Song-yeol administration in a strategic contest under the current very severe regional order. But at the same time, Japanese, especially the Prime Minister Kishida, always concerned about when he shake hand with Yoon Suk-yeol, President Yoon. So there may have some backlash. For example, the just after the summit meeting, more direct summit meeting with President Yoon. So if the liquidation has happened, so this was total disaster, not only in bilateral ties, but also for the Prime Minister Kishida and the Kishida cabinet. So he wanna avoid this kind of situation and should be more cautious about the restoring ties with President Yoon. But so as Ikeda-san mentioned, so now we are facing very severe regional order caused by the North Korean nuclear issues. Talked by the Dr. Sumiteri, and also the rise of China and the recently Taiwan issues. So these are the areas of cooperation for Japan and South Korea and the United States. And as I mentioned, very fortunately, now we've seen very reactivating trilateral cooperation. And at the same time, I would say that now the Japanese government is in the process of revising the national security strategy and the national defense program guideline and so on. So in this context, I really think that now we, Japan and South Korea, should have more active strategic dialogue and talk. Without this strategic corporate talk between Tokyo and Seoul, we, Japan and South Korea, really become diverse trajectory in the near future. So I think we needed to avoid this kind of situation. Thank you.
So before I answer my question, I would like to also just comment a little bit about Korea-Japan piece, just because I want to make this one comment. I absolutely understand Japan's frustration with South Korea and the distrust and everything that Professor Nishino talked about. I absolutely get that. But what I hope that Japanese also understand, and they said, I think Professor Nishino, your earlier comment mentioned, like, you're worried, the Japanese are worried about what may come in 5 years with different administration. That is a real concern. It could absolutely change. I mean, look at the unpopularity right now of the Yoon administration. It could absolutely switch. But because of that, you step back and think about it for a second. We're still at the beginning of the term for the Yoon administration. So I still think it's preferable to work with this administration, because still you have 4 or 5 years before you have a change of government. What happened under Park Geun-hye administration with the deal was it was done too late. So it was kind of like it didn't have time to gel and cement for years before the President Moon came in and reversed it. So I just really hope that both governments don't let go of this opportunity, because I do think there is a little bit of an opportunity here, to make a little bit of progress. So I'll just say that on the Korea-Japan point. About Japan possessing nuclear weapons on that, look, North Koreans are right now saying it's over. Like they always said it's denuclearization over, but now I just spent the whole time, like last 15 minutes talking about this. It's enshrined. They're focusing on this is maybe potentially arms control conversation, but they're not. They're nuclear weapons power, and everything they're doing right now is to show that they want to be a responsible nuclear weapons power, and they want to get international acceptance of North Korea as that. And they're moving towards that direction. And I talked about the external environment, which is favorable for that, because we can't even get anybody to condemn an ICBM launch. So this is the reality. So go for 5 to 10, 15 years. This is a reality that both South Korea and Japan has to live with, right? They have to live with this. So even Korea right now are talking, you keep hearing folks talking about U.S. extended nuclear umbrella, various options. Used to be kind of people who are on the fringe that talked about bringing technical nuclear weapons back to South Korea and so on. Now public even supports, having indigenous nuclear capability. This is also, so it's becoming more and more mainstream, where South Koreans are now even like willing to talk about it a little bit more, whether it's a NATO-style nuclear sharing, or bringing tactical nuclear weapons back to Korea, or even developing their own program, that they should at least look into, examine pros and cons of these options. So even for Japan, I think, you know, you fast forward, I'm not saying this is something the US will support right now, but it absolutely makes sense to me why there is this fear. And then you combine it with, let's say we have a change of administration in the United States too. You don't know what's going to happen with the next election. And let's say, you know, President Trump gets reelected and he talks about, you know, again, pulling out troops from South Korea or whatnot. You combine North Korea's nuclear capability with moving towards world accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, and then combine with perhaps whatever is going on in the United States, you can't really fall our allies to wanting to explore these options, right? So I'm not necessarily saying this is a policy recommendation of any kind, but you are just sort of, I understand the context of why now we are hearing this kind of language. And this is one of the issues that are concerning about arms control negotiation with North Korea, which, you know, I think we need to all think about it, because North Korea, this is what they're demanding. But one of the negative consequences of that, of accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, is regional proliferation risk, which is very real.
And when you think about the Japan-Korea relations and tensions that ebb and flow, part of it comes back to personal leaders and trust and the way they appeal to their political base. And a part comes to these very real security tensions. And so I wonder if you could reflect on how much you think that bringing Japan, Korea in closer cooperation is going to be a leader strategy or just a response to the security crises. And then more specifically, we have a couple of questions in the chat I want to bring to your attention. We have, first of all, Joseph Gerson asking about the Yun Kishida meeting, saying that it seemed like people felt the meeting hadn't gone that well. And this gets to the personal politics that, you know, some reported that Prime Minister Kishida was angered by the way it was announced and reported on. And so this is one concern, again, that it's about leader strategies and emotions of the leader communication. Whereas Leif Erik Easley has a question looking at a really critical issue of information sharing as they face this common security threat. And he asks whether you have any indication that Japan and Korea are going to be engaging in more intelligence sharing. And has there been, you know, as the continued missile strikes from North Korea occur, has that sparked more cooperation between Japan and Korea at the level of the GSOMNIA information sharing agreement? And finally, last question on the chat before I let you both respond. Shin Fujihira asking about, when you look at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy report that outlines some of the policy areas where Japan, ROK, and US could cooperate, many of them are listed: economic issues like the trade agreement, or climate change, COVID, abduction issues. What do you think would be the priority one or two of those issues? So that's a set of questions from the group on the chat. If each of you want to say some response, and then we have even more questions adding on.
Should I go first this time?
Yes, that'll be fine.
Okay. So on your question about personality in the external environment, I think personality in the leadership, it absolutely matters. So when you look at historically, the times that Korea and Japan relationship, which was not always bad, by the way. I mean, there were times that it actually got better. And I'm thinking about, for example, when Kim Dae-jung in 1998, the whole Kim Dae-jung Obuchi declaration, and there was sort of a peak in a Korea-Japan relationship, and, you know, tourism blossomed and you know, soft power in both ways. And, you know, that even led to 2002, both Korea and Japan co-hosting the World Cup and all of that. There was concerted effort that was made between Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi. So, but it was not only the leadership and personality. At that time, there were a couple like external reasons for it, right? There was a Asian financial crisis. There was North Korea missile threat. So sometimes there are interests, right? There are things that happen, but it does require leadership and personality to happen. So I do think it matters, is my point, but not the only thing, but it is one of the important factors, I think, in terms of when you bring in Korea-Japan relationship together. So just looking at historical, that's been the case, right? So I want to sort of remind the audience that it's not always been bad. There were times when the relationship was better, but it does require leadership. Yun Kishida meeting, yeah, I guess it is a point about, it's just really unfortunate, this kind of mishap. And I do think the media also plays a role. They really, right now, President Yoon is very deeply unpopular in South Korea. And I feel like every mishap is like really magnified. Perhaps it was a mishap. I just hope that they can overcome this is so unimportant. And when you have such an important relationship to repair, I'm just so very frustrated by that. But yes, I mean, by all indication, it was not great. It didn't even spend a lot of time together. And, what can we do? Hopefully that they will try to minimize this kind of mishaps going forward. On the info sharing, both are talking, at least with the Yoon administration, they talk about the need to do international. So at least there's rhetorically, it's there. I don't know in terms of evidence whether it got much better or not. Like, I don't have actual concrete, so is it much better now than 6 months ago? I don't have evidence of that. All I can go by is sort of rhetorically, they're saying, okay, this is important, the intelligence sharing is important. And the last question with Shin, Professor Fujihira was saying something about the trilateral cooperation can be advanced. Yes, I do think actually this on the econ space, and it's something that's like, you talked about climate change, you talked about COVID, ICT. I think all of these issues are areas that they can cooperate. And in fact, I almost think that you need to sort of put aside these really sensitive issues and find these areas to cooperate in on. And I think another thing that I would add, in addition to, climate change and economic cohesion, energy, and so on, is also in the Southeast Asia. I think there are some space there where Korea and Japan can find ways to cooperate. There are competitors too, but I think there are areas to coordinate on and collaborate on, and maybe they can agree to sort of disagree on these very sensitive issues like wartime labor and comfort women and whatnot, and sort of focus on these sort of less sensitive issues because there are so many that they can cooperate on.
So I will address three questions. First one is that the Kishida Summit in New York. Yes, it's a bit regrettable, but anyway, I felt kind of the sense of relief when we see a realizing summit between the two leaders, because in my desirable and possible scenario is that the Kishida and the Yoon had a summit meeting in New York, then this will be a start to rebuild trust relationship between the two leaders, and then we needed to have another second summit meeting in Bali or something like another multilateral format in this autumn. And my hope is that the two leaders will have a summit meeting on the sideline of the G7 summit in Hiroshima next year in May. So these are this kind of trajectory is a very the desirable and, in my sense, possible scenario for two leaders to rebuilding the trust relationship between the two countries. And second question on security cooperation between the Japan and the ROK. So as we all know that from the Japanese perspective, especially the government officials' perspective, we needed to, in a way, address the so-called the radar lock-on issue and the rising sun flag issue in 2018. But as far as I know, now South Korean government, Yoon Suk-yeol government administration, try to address this difficult issue by, in a way, how can I say, in a way, making kind of the crisis management mechanism to prevent similar situation again between the two countries. This will be a kind of start to revitalizing the defense cooperation between the two countries. And third question on the possible cooperation area between the two countries. My recommendation is that the easy one is the cooperation on the vis-a-vis North Korea nuclear issue. On the defense and the deterrence side, we, Japan and South Korea, clearly can make cooperation, because now both countries quite emphasize the extended deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea's very sophisticated nuclear and missile capabilities. So, and we needed to cooperate more on this kind of issue. And also another, I think, easy one is that cooperation on North Korean human rights issue in North Korea. So now the South Korea Yoon government appointed new ambassador on North Korean human rights issue, Professor Lee Shin-hwa. And I've heard that now the U.S. Biden administration is preparing the appointment of the new ambassador. And so as we all know that the Japanese government always put emphasis on the abduction issue. So these this kind of issue are quite possible and a promising area for cooperation, not only bilateral, but also trilateral cooperation. And last one is I really hope that South Korea can enter CPTPP, but so always the domestic politics matter, especially at this point, Yoon government is not the majority ruling party in the Diet. So this means that President Yoon will have a difficulty in the ratifying the agreement in South Korean government. But I really hope that Yoon government try to enter not only the IPEF but also CPTPP. Thank you.
Yes, I share your hopes that South Korea will join the CPTPP. It was good that at least South Korea and Japan are in RCEP together. So some deepening of economic ties will happen through that agreement. But I think that working on more fronts would be important. We have some questions that I would like to direct to you. Jack Maslia pulls on the question, Sumi Terry, in your presentation, you mentioned that North Korea might consider preemptive strike. And Jack is concerned if either Japan or the ROK were to have a nuclear program, would that in itself trigger a preemptive strike by North Korea? Or do we think that North Korea is only reserving its weapons for a last case scenario? We also have a question from Jeffrey Allen looking at what is going to be the role of North Korea in supplying Russia? Do we think that there's going to be a case where North Korea continues to be supplementing provision of military hardware to Russia, given its ongoing conflict in the war in Ukraine? What measures should Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington collectively be doing to thwart this scenario from evolving? Is this an opportunity to work more on restricting any kind of exchange from North Korea to Russia? I also have a third question in the chat to me directly by CK Ha, asking you, what do you think are the chances for security cooperation between Japan, Korea, and the United States towards China? And I think this draws on the South China Seas issues, as well as broader security tensions in the region vis-a-vis the latest tensions spiking over Taiwan. Do you see those concerns bringing another opportunity for deeper trilateral cooperation?
Okay, So let me first try to answer Jack Maslia's question on scenarios about Japan, South Korea, whether they can receive U.S. nuclear weapons or pursue their own nuclear capability. And what North Korea would think of that. I mean, North Korea would, of course, not like that. And I think this is why they're already making this threat. Who knows confidently where they, is that going to be enough for them to trigger North Korea using nuclear weapons? I doubt it, just because I think the regime is all about regime survival. And I don't think, they are necessarily, they know the moment they use nuclear weapons is really the regime, it's over for the regime. So I do think that it is for the last possible case scenario. I don't think they will really prematurely use it, although they are threatening to use it, and that makes sense why they are threatening to use it. Regardless, they have signaled a very significant maturation of its nuclear deterrent. They're trying to send a clear message that any attempt on Kim Jong-un's life or the weapons that prop up the regime will lead to nuclear war, and at least they are making that threat. Just at the present moment, in terms of U.S. perspective, I think U.S. government is highly unlikely to support, either tactical nuclear weapons or either South Korea or Japan going nuclear. Just looking at South Korea, they're like that's not what they want, right? They don't want to, redeploy tactical nuclear weapons or South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons. Many in the U.S. military were just right now simply does not see the need for such a step, because U.S. can hit any target in North Korea using very highly precise conventional weapons. And if the conflict escalates and there is ever need to use nuclear weapons, they can be delivered from a variety of existing secure platforms, such as ballistic missile submarines and long-range bombers. So, many in the United States argue that if nuclear weapons are also stationed in South Korea, or let's say Japan, they could be, tempting targets for North Korean missiles, right? Which of course can reach any target in South Korea or Japan. So from US perspective, we keep saying to South Koreans, because they keep talking about this right now, that, hey, having 28,500 American troops in South Korea right now should be the strongest evidence of our deep commitment to defend South Korea. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, these arguments do not convince many skeptics in South Korea or in Japan when, North Korea keeps making threats, focus on tactical nuclear weapons, all that they are doing. So, I do think, that's why I say I understand from the Korean and Japanese perspective where they make these arguments, but at least that's the perspective of the United States right now. The second question was it on security cooperation between Japan, Korea, and the United States toward China? That's really interesting, because as everybody knows, at least President Yoon has rhetorically said things, they're saying at least, tougher on China than the previous administration. And they've actually taken some steps, right? They said, for example, on the 3 no's policy of President Moon, saying, hey, they're not going to necessarily go with that. They said, on that, this is our issue, don't butt in. And so they've taken some things, or like, IPEF, they've shown some willingness or taken more steps, but then they've done things like, Nancy Pelosi, when she visited Korea, that kind of made some Koreans kind of say, oh, wait a minute, was that because of consideration of China? The reality is, I do think there's a room for cooperation on some issues, certainly more than the previous administration, but then there's a limit to this too. At the end of the day, China is South Korea's #1 trading partner. South Korea, China trade volume is double that of South Korea, US, South Korea, Japan combined. And, with the difficult economic situation that South Korea is facing, there's still a limit to that. So I think we need to have sort of temporary expectation. And I think we will see that gap between the rhetoric and the reality. There was one more question.
About the support for Russia and the possibility that North Korea would become a channel. Right
now, I feel, we were just kind of like, what is North Korea pledging, and some artillery and whatnot. It is very concerning development. This is what I said, sort of, this is a realignment with now China, Russia with North Korea. I do think that North Korea is cash strapped, and they will supply Russia with whatever weapons they can. This is also a way to make money, right? Because right now, under sanctions and under last several years under COVID, they've been really suffering economically. And we know in the past, they proliferate everything. So why not, like help out Russia, have a closer relationship with Russia, and get to also make some money. I don't know how we can necessarily stop that from happening between North Korea and Russia, but this is it's a concern that I absolutely share.
Okay, I will address two questions on North Korea and cooperation toward China. First one is that actually I'm a bit pessimistic in the making progress on North Korean issue for a couple of years because Kim Jong-un declared he now is conducting the defense development 5-year plan, including nuclear and missile capabilities. And also, as Dr. Sumiteri mentioned, the recently North Korea legislated the law of the nuclear use. So in this context, I am a bit pessimistic in a couple of years for making progress on nuclear issues. So in this context, I would say that at this point, we have to put emphasis more on the deterrence and defense side. So always the number one, deterrence, number two, pressure or coercion, and number three, negotiation or dialogue. So these are the always the three combinations. But at this point, we have to put more emphasis on the number one, defense side. So in this context, as I mentioned earlier, we need and we can more cooperate on this area. And the second question regarding our cooperation with China, I would say three areas. First one is the economic security, especially the supply chain issues. So now the South Korea are also trying to diversify its economic cooperation with China, and Japan also needed to address this issue. So we have to, and we needed to cooperate more on supply chain issues. So to do so, as I mentioned earlier, Japanese government should make more positive attitude to lift economic restriction in 2019. And the second cooperative area is the capacity building in Southeast Asian countries. Actually, this area is also conducted by South Korean government and Japanese government separately. But now is a time to cooperate more on the capacity building in Southeast Asia. And lastly, the last cooperative area is the effort to sustain the rule-based order in East Asia, Asia-Pacific region. So fortunately, Yoon government is now trying to make South Korean version of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I really hope that this new strategy can give more diplomatic space for Japan and South Korea and the United States to cooperate more in this area. Thank you.
Yes, the shared support for a rule-based order is so important. We hope it won't lead to rival groupings, but I do think it is an interesting issue about whether the economic cooperation will be a source of positive or negative between Japan and Korea, because on the financial sphere, there has been competition. And as you're mentioning, Nishino-san, the trade dispute is quite significant. And at a time when everyone is increasing national security restrictions on trade, coming up with ways to screen for inward investment, screen for outward investment, target products that should only be made at home. The United States is putting forward an initiative for its allies to cooperate more on coming up with an agreement. But at the same exact time, we have Japan and Korea with the WTO dispute because they can't agree on how to regulate free trade versus national security concerns. And I completely agree with you that they should sit down and work this out and set a positive example of how do you decide what products should be restricted and which products can be openly traded? What are the due diligence to make sure it doesn't get passed on to the enemy? And, not only are we trying to stop North Korea funneling weapons to Russia, we're trying to stop the technology of Japan and Korea and the United States from getting into the wrong hands. And that's an area for cooperation where I think trilateral efforts, IPEF has a big priority on this, security of the supply chains. So I completely agree that that's an important issue to look into. I think we're coming at the end of our time. I would say that we've got a really nice question here by Sunwoo Pong in the chat, asking about whether you could see any possibility that China will restrain North Korea. And I know that, there was discussion of the external environment being a critical factor, and that right now there's a concern that the external environment is actually letting North Korea get away with troublemaking. But is there a possibility, as Sun Wupong asks, that maybe amidst all of the uncertainty in the world, China would step up and try and pull back North Korea? And I'm only going to let you each have one sentence on that because we are getting close to the time. But I wonder if you're optimistic that we might see China as a positive force in the coming year.
I am pessimistic. I'm not saying never. We saw in 2017 in the fall where China actually did implement sanctions, which surprised many Korea watchers. Chinese love to say no war, no instability, no nukes, and in that order in terms of priority. And that's because they were really concerned about potential conflict on the Korean Peninsula that made them act. But now 2017, 2022 is not 2017. So many things happen. And after summitry with Xi Jinping having met with Kim Jong-un, and now the geopolitical environment being what it is, I'm not pessimistic. They didn't even condemn an ICBM launch. I doubt that they can even condemn a nuclear test, seventh nuclear test.
Okay. Would you like to add any comment, Nishino-san?
Yes, regarding China issue, after the party congress in China and Xi Jinping start his third period, I hope that we, Japan and South Korea, can more, in a way, a bit engagement policy towards China to make kind of the situation management level. Yes, it's not the resolution, but the current situation is really unstable. I really want to see this kind of the manage control situation after the party congress in China in this autumn. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We could easily go on much longer. This is such an important topic, but we've already learned quite a bit from your presentations. Thank you to our panelists, Sumi, Terry, and Junya Nishino. Thank you to the staff of the program in U.S.-Japan Relations. And thank you to the audience for staying with us to engage with excellent questions and conversation. Thank you. Have a good evening.